The entire conference room went silent after I finished presenting the quarterly projections, but the silence was broken by the sharp, mocking sound of my boss laughing right in my face. It wasn't a polite chuckle or a nervous reaction, it was a full head-back laugh that made the veins in his neck stand out. He looked around the table at the other directors, gesturing toward my presentation slides as if I had just performed a stand-up comedy routine instead of a data-driven analysis. "You actually think we should pivot the entire budget based on your little feelings?" he asked, wiping a tear from his eye while the rest of the team looked down at their notebooks in awkward silence. I had spent 3 weeks staying late every night to pull those numbers, sacrificing my weekends and missing my sister's birthday dinner to make sure every decimal point was perfect. I knew the data was solid, and I knew the current strategy was bleeding money, but standing there under the fluorescent lights, I felt myself shrinking. My boss, Greg, is a reputation for being tough, but this was something else entirely. This was a public execution of my professional reputation. I felt the heat rising in my neck and face, that prickling sensation of humiliation that makes it hard to swallow. I looked at my colleague Sarah, hoping for a shred of support, but she wouldn't even meet my eyes. Greg finally stopped laughing and leaned forward, his elbows hitting the mahogany table with a heavy thud. "Listen, kid, you're here to crunch the numbers I give you, not to try and play CEO," he said, his voice dropping into a condescending growl. I tried to speak, to point out that the third slide clearly showed a 40% drop in engagement, but he waved his hand dismissively. "Sit down and let the adults talk about the real strategy. We don't have time for your fantasies today." I didn't sit down immediately. I stayed standing for 5 seconds too long, feeling the weight of every hour of unpaid overtime I had given to this man. The meeting continued as if I weren't even in the room, with Greg recycling the same failed ideas that had put us in this hole in the first place. I sat there watching him, really looking at him, and realized that his laughter wasn't about my work being bad, it was about him being terrified that I was right. He couldn't argue with the logic, so he had to destroy the messenger. The realization didn't make the humiliation go away, but it replaced the shame with a cold, hard knot of anger. I waited until the meeting adjourned and everyone scurried out of the room like they were escaping a crime scene. I followed Greg back to his office, shutting the door behind me before he could sit down. "We need to talk about what happened in there," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. He didn't even look up from his phone. "I told you, kid, sit down and do your job. The conversation is over." "No, it isn't," I replied, stepping closer to his desk. "You laughed because you know the numbers are right and you don't have a plan to fix the mess you made." He finally looked up, his eyes narrowing, and for a second I thought he was going to fire me on the spot. Instead, he just scoffed and told me to get out of his office before I made things worse for myself. I walked back to my desk, packed up my personal items, and left my badge on the keyboard without saying a word to anyone. I didn't have another job lined up and I didn't have a safety net, but I knew that staying in that chair meant accepting that my voice didn't matter. As I walked out of the building, the sun was hitting the glass windows, and I felt a strange sense of relief. 2 days later, the company announced a massive restructuring because the projections I presented were proven correct by the board.